trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is all about training and racing at altitude and training and racing in the heat and how to leverage those two conditions to improve your performance. On the podcast today, I have the incredible Lindsay Golich. Lindsay and I have known each other for many, many years, going back to our intern days when we were first getting our teeth cut, working with endurance athletes. And now, Lindsay is an exercise physiologist at the High Altitude and Environmental Training Center and Athlete Performance Lab at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, Colorado. On a daily basis, Lindsay is advising the best athletes and the best coaches on how to get prepared for altitude and for the heat. I had a lot of fun with this conversation. Every single conversation I have with Lindsay is a hoot. We always go back to our coaching roots, and we always go back to what is best for the athletes that are preparing for these types of events. So let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Lindsay Golich. First off, the High Altitude and Environmental Training Center and Athlete Performance Lab. Do you have to say that every time you introduce yourself?
No. So Randy Wilbur, who's one of our senior physiologists, he came up with the acronym HATC for High Altitude Training Center. And that came from some of our earlier physiologists. You mentioned like JT Kearney and a few others, people that had been there where they started doing, this live high, train low experimentation, many, many years ago. And it really was the evolution of training at altitude and how it all works. So we call it the HATC. And I always joke too, because when I say to a lot of people high altitude, they think we're always going up in altitude. And I would say, 90% of what we do is we actually bring the room down to sea level since we are at altitude. Rather than it going up in elevation, we're always bringing it down. And then our athlete performance lab, it's just, it's a mouthful, but there's a lot that goes on in there. So there's no good acronym for that.
It's just a mouthful, Lindsay. I'm just giving you some
We've
crap.
got a lot of acronyms, so.
Yeah. Well, maybe we won't add to that. So, but before we go any further, let's get kind of like a physical description of like your neck of the woods with the the HATC and the Athlete Performance Lab. Like give the listeners a little bit of a scope of like what the room is like and what the tools and the, all the different toys that you have to like test the athletes and things like that.
Sure. So our HATC, we're located in the area called Sports Sciences at the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And in sports sciences, it's not just exercise physiology or sport physiology. We also have dietetics, we have psychology, and technology in there. So there's a few of us that share that space. And the nice thing is in our environmental room and also in the athlete performance lab, we're able to have that shared space and be doing multiple different things depending on what sport group is in there. But in our high altitude training center, the HATC, it's about a 900 square foot room. And in that room, we can change 3 environmental conditions. We can change the altitude, we can change the temperature, and we can change the humidity. So really with altitude, we can go down to sea level. We can go up to about 24,000 feet. The temperature, we can go to -5 Fahrenheit. And then we can also go to about 115 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity, we can get to single digits humidity and then 100% humidity. So really the objective there is that we can match any training and competition environment in the world that athletes are preparing for. And that even goes for winter sports. We've had quite a few winter sport athletes come in for equipment testing or even just testing of different training conditions as well. Obviously, we can't get to negative temperatures, but where you look at a lot of the Winter Olympics have been held over the last few cycles, it hasn't been in very, very extreme cold locations.
And I remember when the Rio Olympics were coming around and you and I were having this conversation, a lot of what you were doing there it was kind of like worst case scenario types of testing with the athletes. You bring the athletes in and say, okay, based on the historical patterns of Rio, this is about how hot and how humid it's going to get. Let's put you on a treadmill. Let's put you on a cycling ergometer and see how you react to that environment in a little bit of an educational lesson for the coach or for the coach for the athlete or for the coach and the athlete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say we were lucky that we had the room. We officially opened up the room in 2015. With plenty of time to get ready for the Rio Olympics. And we were able to target track and field, our marathon, our distance team, triathlon, and cycling were the three sports that we really put the emphasis into. So post Rio and getting ready for Tokyo, we've really been able to expand that to quite a few other athletes and not just our traditional endurance aerobic type of athletes. But yet we've done all of our triathletes, all of our cyclists, quite a few of our distance runners. We've now had all our boxing athletes, a lot of our wrestling athletes, almost a lot of our Paralympic programming that is a resident program for triathlon, cycling, track and field as well come through. So we're doing the same thing, is that we can say, hey, here's the conditions of Tokyo, and they are going to be extreme. So Tokyo is going to be one of the hottest Olympics that we've had to date. It has the potential to be there. Delaying it a year doesn't change anything. The dates are exactly the same from 2020 to 2021, just 1 year later. So we'll put athletes in the environment of their competition of what we anticipate it to be, and or we can go to what the extreme might be, and then we can see how their performance is impacted. And so what we've done, or what I've done quite a bit of, is what I've called our heat stress testing. So, we set the athlete up to fail, basically. So I want them to reach a point of failure, because then it gives me an idea of what they can tolerate. And then we can then work with their coaching, nutrition, anyone else on their performance team, and work backwards of saying, well, we know this is a limitation. So how can we minimize or delay the onset to that point? Or what can we do differently in training so we don't reach that point at all? And I feel like we've been really impactful with a lot of our athletes to better understanding that, simple things like in a marathon running race, you could go out really hard in that first 10K, but what is that cost over that last 5K of the race? If your internal core temperature just gets too hot too quickly, can you actually begin to limit it or bring it back down? And so we've been able to really pinpoint what that means for each athlete and different pacing strategies and nutritional strategies and hydrational strategies as well.
And what do you consider the point of failure? Like, I think this might get into some of the ways that you're actually monitoring the athlete. So you're having them go hard in a hot environment, but like paint that picture a little bit more for the listeners to let them know like how hard and how hot these athletes are having to train in.
Yeah. So pretty much for our heat stress testing, we have 3 points of failure. The first one is if your internal core temperature exceeds 104 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 42 degrees Celsius is our cutoff.
That's friggin' hot.
Yeah.
That's
so
really
it's
hot. That's
really
hot.
Normally if you have a child and they have a temperature of 102, you're going to, the hospital or the ER, right? That's, put them in a cold bath. So we have a core temperature of 104. We'll set a timeline, like a time limit based upon the athlete, of saying like it could be a 60-minute test, 70, 90-minute test. It just depends on what demographic is in there. Or if the athlete can't physically go anymore. So we've had people pass out. We've had people get sick. People just say they just can't take another step. So there's a little bit of everything. And all 3 situations or scenarios happen all the time. And, I've had the same athlete come in multiple times, and we've had the 3 different scenarios happen 3 different times. And that's also a learning curve. We had an athlete that came to us, and we were figuring out traveling across multiple time zones. So they had actually just returned from being a competition in Asia, and they were testing with me 2 days later. So what did that additional stress of travel do on their core temperature regulation? And for that athlete, it was worse. So, it's helping us figure out how close to a competition date can we arrive to our point of, our destination point. And obviously 2 days is too short, and we knew that in advance, but we're really trying to test the limits of saying, if I'm having to chase points all over the world, do I need to be there 2 days before, 5 days before, 7 days before? So We can see different things happen for different reasons in the same athlete, even if their fitness is really high.
So you've got these athletes, you put them into a really hot, really stressful environment, you take them to the point of failure, and then you're working with them and their team, their coach, their nutritionist, and things like that, and saying, okay, here's where the athlete was failing. Here's why they were failing. Here are some different interventions that we might want to try to alleviate this point of failure. I know that all of those, and you and I are going to be really like-minded on that, is where it's very individualized because the conditions are different. The athlete is different. They're coming from a different time zone, where they failed, why they failed, all that other stuff. But for the listeners out there, are there any broad brushstrokes in terms of the interventions that you apply in those scenarios where the athlete gets overhot, they can't take another step, they puke, they're doing all these other things? Are there any like common things to like pull out of that?
Yeah, for sure there are. I mean, I think the number one thing is going into an extreme environment, whether it be heat, humidity, altitude, you want to be as fit as you can be. So that's like general goal number one. So if you have a race, a running race or triathlon race, and it's, somewhere in the South in the US, or you're traveling to a different country for a competition, you just want to make sure your fitness is high. That will help you, one, tolerate those extreme conditions better. The second one is hydration is really important. We hear a lot about don't drink too much, or you're not drinking enough, or you're drinking, everything is in between. But ultimately, super easy. You can do pre and post body weight and figure out what your sweat rate is. And then you're trying to hydrate accordingly. You don't need to come out even at the end, but you're trying to minimize your losses. So we're trying to minimize, a weight loss. If you have a 1-day event, we don't really want it to exceed, at the extreme end, 6 to 10%. A lot of literature out there says 2 to 3%. And I agree with that in a training perspective of if I have multiple training sessions a day, or I'm doing multiple races back-to-back days. But if you have like a 1-day, let's say you're doing a marathon and it's one marathon and that's it, and you have nothing else before or after it, you could probably get away with a little bit higher rate of dehydration if you're prepared for it, meaning that you've trained in those situations. You're not intentionally trying to become extremely dehydrated, but it shouldn't impact your performance drastically.
So none of the cycling strategies where they're intentionally trying to dehydrate before the bottom of the climb in order to lose a little bit of weight. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're referring to?
Correct.
So
yes,
the listeners will remember a podcast that I did. Which one is this? With Stavros Kavouras, who, Lindsay, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, where we went through a little bit of that dehydration research. So they'll get a chuckle out of it. So you're telling me at HATC, like with all this fancy stuff that you have, you've got core temperature monitors, you've got, a room that can simulate almost any reasonable athletic condition possible. All the different stuff that you can put in there, ergometers, treadmills, you kind of name it. It's coming down to the preventative measures, or the common preventative measures are fitness and hydration.
Yeah. And I would say tolerance of heat is almost 100% preventative measures. During a competition, you're trying to hydrate throughout or consume calories throughout, but that becomes individualized of how much you actually need. And, I think a lot of the literature out there in how your body responds to heat and humidity over the last 10, 20 years, it's not telling us anything drastically new that we don't know as scientists, sports scientists. The way that I see the best utilization of the room, these core temperature devices, all the other technologies that athletes can wear and giving us real-time biometrics as they're doing their training, helps to educate the athlete and the coach on what's actually happening internally. An athlete can really identify what's happening, but sometimes they're not good at verbalizing that to a coach. So a coach can't understand, all of a sudden an athlete looks great, at an elite level, an elite runner, when they're running at 100%, they look great. When they're running at 90%, they actually still look really good. It's not like me when I go out and run and I get tired. You can tell the difference, but as our professional athletes, their efficiency and economy of running is so high, it's hard to identify that, but we can actually see that what's taking place, and it becomes a greater education of the impact of what that means on performance.
So a lot of what you're doing, you're like educating the athletes and their coaches
Yeah.
and their support staff on what's going on. I'm always curious to know with like professionals like yourself, Lindsay, because you are a coach. I mean, you and I have a coaching relationship that goes back where we were colleagues for 15 years now.
Yeah,
I mean,
probably.
it's a long time, and you're a darn good coach. Like, how does it work with you working with other athletes and other coaches, like putting on the testing hat and then taking off the testing hat and then having to put the coaching hat on? Like how does that dynamic work where you're working with other athletes that have other coaches and you have to provide counsel to both?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be tricky because sometimes I think, I can see the numbers and I can see what's happening, but then I don't actually know, what's happening on a day-to-day basis with that athlete and their coach relationship, right? So I get a snippet of what's happening, and I have very objective data that I can quantify and I can provide feedback. For some athletes I see day to day, and we have a little bit easier conversations with those athletes and coaches. There's a term I heard on a podcast a few years ago saying, like, you become a translational physiologist. So my goal is to capture the data and work on a better way to translate that data of information to coaching an athlete. So, I can say, like, this is your number, but that may not mean anything. So you have to come across a little bit as a coach, right, to understand, to have that background of saying, okay, here's how we're actually going to apply it on our day-to-day basis or for our competition. Because if I just say, like, it has to be X, and the coach looks at me and is like, you're crazy, that's never going to happen, then that's not helpful either.
I love that, translational physiologist. Let's pull on that a little bit, because as you said from the onset, there's three things that you can manipulate, right? You can manipulate the heat, the humidity, and we're going to combine those into the just heat environment, right? Mm-hmm. And you can manipulate the altitude as well. Since Tokyo is going to be probably going to be the hottest Olympics on record, and it's hot right now in Colorado Springs and all over the country where fires are burning and everything else. Heat's going to be the most pertinent. So what can athletes do aside from let me pose this question a little bit differently. What are we going to see at the Tokyo Olympics? Because all of the NGBs and all the support staff and people like yourself, and they already have, because Tokyo was supposed to happen, they've already put their thinking caps on and said, okay, how are we going to get the athletes ready for the race walk event, the marathon events, the track and field events, the cycling events, all these things that are in these hot environments? We're not going to get to see that until next year, but you probably can guess what's going to happen in terms of the different interventions that come out. What are we going to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully we don't see anything different than we've seen in many other Olympics, at least from the US. I can say the US is that we're going in really well prepared. We're fortunate that almost all of our sports had the ability to complete a test event in Tokyo. So when they had the opportunity to travel there, they had the opportunity to compete in a similar type of environmental conditions. So for triathlon, their test event was exactly 1 year prior to the date that they would be competing in the Olympic Games. So we had a really good perspective of what the conditions are going to be like and what obstacles could be thrown at us, and what we need to do to be better prepared. And I feel like looking at that event as an example is that not just the US, but a lot of the other countries had done a good job of their homework and what they needed to provide their athletes and coaches with to be prepared for competition. So I think the main things, which is no surprise, the use of ice vests, cooling devices has been huge. I know there was a huge push for that actually around the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, because they're also quite hot and humid. And then going into Sydney in 2000, Sydney, Australia, those two Olympics, there was a big heat push. So figuring out cooling vests, ice slushy drinks, all these different things, we're just finding better ways to use those and incorporate them in our day-to-day training. So it's less overt, I guess. But I think the cooling vest will be the biggest thing. The nice thing, Tokyo has an infrastructure to support this is that all the athletes staging prior to competition and immediately after competition has cooling tents, where they're air conditioned and nice and cool. So I think, we'll see athletes rather than necessarily like standing out at the finish, they'll be kind of whisked away into a cooler environment and doing their interviews in those type of environments. But I think if you weren't really keen on it, you might not notice too much from at least the US. And I believe most countries are going to be really well prepared in these extreme conditions. So hopefully we don't see anything, too catastrophic from athletes going in really underprepared.
If cooling vest is going to be the thing, and I always relate this back to the last Olympics where cupping was the thing. Right. Yeah. Cupping that was the modality that came out of that Olympics, because all the swimmers who just happened, like they're shirtless and you can kind of see their bodies and you can actually see the cupping marks. It's very prevalent. That was the hot modality right after the last Olympics. So if cooling vests are going to be like the hot modality after this Olympics, like what is the everyday practical use case for like a normal athlete that's doing, when the mass participation events come back, what's the normal application going to be for those types of athletes that are doing the New York City Marathon or a triathlon or an ultramarathon or something like that?
Yeah, I think if you were to do, triathlon's kind of funky in like the longer distance races, depending on the temperature body of water. So for Tokyo, the water temperature for the triathlon, it's actually quite warm. It's same with open water swimming. But, even athletes, if you look at the Kona Ironman World Championships, the water temperature is warm, but not hot. So there's not a high need to use a cooling vest in that type of environment. Now, same thing with New York City Marathon. Typically the time of year, it's not blazing hot, but maybe Chicago Marathon's a good example. Okay. Is that there's been a couple of years where it's been really hot. I would think that you'd see more athletes wearing a cooling vest up to the starting line, or warming up in a cooling vest prior to getting into their corral before the start of the race, as trying to lower their core temperature and be better prepared. I think too, one thing that I've seen, which it's not anything super new, but I just think I see more and more distance runners and ultra runners, marathoners running with water now, where 5 or 6 years ago, I think like the ultra running community was the only community you'd see like running around with like, water bottles and different things. And now I feel like everybody in my neighborhood has a water bottle in their hand. So I think there's just some general education that's getting passed down of understanding, I can run with a bottle on even my 15-mile run. I don't have to wait till I get to my 20+ mile run now I have to carry my water with me.
I can see a lot of people also like DIYing their own cooling vests with just cold towels and ice, which is perfectly, that's just as effective, or can be just as effective.
Yeah. And those are strategies like we've partnered with Nike, and they have this really neat cooling vest that we came up with as a design for Tokyo. I believe you can purchase it now. They were waiting till the Olympics, but I think they're probably out for distribution now. But before that, and even using those, there's times when we still have a Ziploc bag full of ice that we're handing out to athletes, a cold towel dumped in a bucket of ice, or even cold water if we can't get ice. Those are strategies, even though when we have all the latest and greatest technologies, there's locations and places that we go to that all of a sudden nothing work. You can't find freezers to freeze your cooling vests, but you have an ice machine. So you do your best. We've also found that like using misters, if you're just sitting around, can really help with the fan. So if you have a fan and a misting, that can really help to lower the temperature of a space by quite a bit, which then helps you to better thermoregulate just that environmental heat. So
can you describe like how much of a difference that would make either in your lab, because that's a lot of what you do is just A/B testing. You bring the person in the lab, here's the environment, just go run. We'll see where you fail. Okay, we'll do the ice vest intervention or cooling vest intervention. We'll see how much of a difference that makes. Can you broadly like paint the picture of how much of a difference does it make in a hot environment to use some sort of cooling intervention?
Yeah. So, I'm fortunate that I've got access to all this, and that even athletes, we'll do testing in our lab, and then we'll have testing out in the field. And then we can even do real life testing in competition. So these core temperature pills athletes will swallow during an event, and we'll see, did we do it all right, or where did we fall short? But what we've seen is by adding in these interventions of better hydration, the timing of hydration, using cooling devices of, cooling vest or warm up strategy in a cold environment, meaning air conditioned room rather than, being outside. Those type of things, we've been able to see a delay of the onset of their threshold of that internal core temperature by up to about 6%. So that's a pretty significant shift over the course of a 10K. So if we just look at a triathlon, for example, so 6% is all the difference of getting on the podium and being like 15th in a race. That can be from the run or the bike. And a lot of that, it allows for the athlete to make better decisions because they're not overheating, or their perception of the environment isn't as high. So their reaction times are better. So on the bike, they can hopefully, make the break if that's happening, or avoid crashes or different things that could be catastrophic. And allow, again, that 6%, even if it's 1% for some athletes, that's a significant gain, because we're not trying to change their training, which is the hard part. You're not trying to do more training or less training or higher intervals. We're just changing some of the strategies around your training. And if we can get 1% out of it, it's a significant gain in overall performance.
And literally what you'd be talking about is warming up in a cool environment, or warming up with the cooling vest on as like a basic intervention to get this delayed onset of their core temperature increasing.
Yeah, exactly.
Simple intervention.
Yeah, simple.
I mean, a lot of times we think about like these really complex ways of, you remember the cooling glove back in, when was that? Like the early 2000s when they were testing that out on a cycling ergometer. And so for the, I'll post in the show notes for the listeners, I'll post a link to this device, which creates a negative pressure environment around your hand and circulates cold water, specifically on the palm of your hand. It's supposed to cool you off. Great. It works, but it's too complicated in an athletic environment to make much of a difference. There's some applications for it, but it's too complicated for most athletic. So what we're talking about with the cooling vest is like literally just slapping some cold water in a towel and warming up that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you're trying to figure out, what you have access to. And yes, you can make it really complicated, but at the end of the day, it's not reality. So it's just like, maybe your pre-race workout, depending on what time of day your race competition happens, you're running on the treadmill inside in the air-conditioned room instead of running for that 20 or 30 minutes outside. So you're just minimizing the overall stress from the morning and everything else before you get to the starting line of your event.
Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit and ask a kind of a crazy question about the heat before we go to altitude. You get to see all these types of athletes. At the beginning, it was just the endurance athletes, but now it looks like you've got some of the combat sport athletes and maybe even some of the team sport athletes as well.
Yep.
Which one of those athletes like handle the hot environments the best? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I have not seen a specific rhyme or reason. I know there's some theories out there, but what I've seen, there's so many other factors that go into it, is that like I've had one athlete who can handle the heat in competition really well, but when we included travel, it all fell apart. That same athlete came in one time and they were sick. They had a cold and it all fell apart. So there's so many different factors that, really impact. I think there probably is something greater to it, but it's beyond my thing. If there's some genetic, predisposition, again, there are theories out there on it, but I have not seen it actually work at an elite level of being like extremely true one way or another. I just think overall preparation of doing all the right things, as we said, like eating well, hydrating well, being rested, showing up to the starting line, ready to go and being relaxed about the situation. So not super high stressed also makes a big difference in the overall outcome of how you're going to adapt and respond to the heat.
Nobody can see this. This is a failure of audio, but Lindsay and I are kind of like chuckling as we're going through this conversation, because we've probably had it 100 times. It just comes down to fitness, you know?
Yeah. And it's a similar thing as you're saying to altitude, right? I know probably getting a little ahead of ourselves, but you have extreme mountain climbers that have climbed and summited Everest, and they've done it once or twice. And on the third time, then they get altitude sickness.
Yeah.
So there's different reasons why, and each of them, they can go back and kind of have an idea of why. Maybe they had a cold, or they were not as well going into that final peak, or their summit to the top, or whatever it might be, right? So there's just things physiologically that if we're trying to minimize the risk, I guess, right, of what we know can hurt performance.
Okay, so let's go to altitude.
Sure.
So you've got this room, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners out there, and even some of your athletes, when they find out that they've got this tool available to them that can go up to 22,000 feet. Is that what you said? 22,000 feet? They're going to be like, put me at that. Like, give me that dose. That's what I want. I want to train at altitude. I've heard all this awesome stuff about training high and training at altitude. That's what's going to make all my red blood cells go bananas, and I'm going to get super fit just by being exposed to this environment. But as you mentioned at the very beginning, most times you're bringing the altitude down from our 6,000 foot, living space here in Colorado Springs. Why is that the case?
Yeah. I mean, one, we're trying to be prepared for the events that our athletes are traveling to. So in the Olympic format, there's really very few events, I guess, that even take place at altitude. There's a couple mountain bike races a year that are at a moderate altitude, but they don't exceed 10,000 feet. And then you think, okay, well, skiing, that might be an event. But even when you look at their World Cup circuit, the highest mountain that they're going to is here in Colorado when they're at Breckenridge or Beaver Creek. A lot of the other mountains in Europe, they're very high, but they're starting at sea level, where Colorado, we're starting at, 6,000-7,000 feet of vertical. So we're not at extreme altitudes very much within sport. So we don't need to prepare for that. And when we go through a lot of the scientific literature of training, there hasn't been anything to show at an elite level of extreme altitude preparation, meaning training high, very high, so higher than Colorado Springs or higher than our 10,000 foot mark, that allows for increased performance for endurance athletes. So what we've actually seen is that it can hinder performance. So we're limited as we go up the mountain, so to speak. Our ability to perform decreases, whether it's at a threshold or a VO2 at a high intensity or anaerobic level. And so really in training, we're trying not to do that. We want athletes to, not decrease their ability to do more work. We want them to do more work. So really going high is not really in an ideal situation for most athletes.
It's interesting to see, like, just the way that this altitude thing has perpetuated over the course of, the last couple of decades, because it used to be almost de facto, where any endurance athlete or any team, they would always do an altitude camp. And it's still prevalent, but it's becoming less and less so, because, at least in my observation, I want to hear your take on this as well, but at least in my observation, we're noticing kind of like two things. Is one, you do see people's decreased capacity to do work, and sometimes they get worse after the altitude camp or the altitude exposure, however you're doing. They're training at altitude, they're living at altitude, or some combination of both of those. And then the second thing is we're starting to realize that the camps themselves, because it's such an isolated environment, that's what creates this super compensation, this really positive benefit, is because they've gotten rid of all of the distractions and all they can focus on is training. It's not the altitude, it's like all the other things that are kind of like wrapped around the quote unquote camp. I don't know if you've noticed that in your dealings with athletes as well, though.
I think it depends on what sport group. So for a lot of our track and field athletes, our distance athletes, so athletes that are 5K, 10K marathon, we actually do quite a bit of altitude training. So whether we have a group that lives and trains here in Colorado Springs, we have quite a few groups that come out to Woodland Parks. That's right around 8,500 feet. But we don't go above that. We know that once we start going higher than that 8,500 foot mark for living at altitude, performance decreases. And we do the same thing with our triathlon groups and cycling groups. We have quite a few cyclists right now that are out here in Colorado getting ready for the Road World Championships, which still have not yet been canceled, and they're going to take place in about 5 weeks. So we're moving forward as is. So we've got a few of our women out here getting ready, doing altitude precursor before they head over to Europe for racing. But I think it's a combination of things. Again, I'm fortunate that I've got the tools and technology to assess an athlete coming to altitude. So there's a few factors that we always want to look at prior to coming to altitude. Is that, do you have the red blood cells and iron in your body to tolerate that initial adaptation that's going to take place? So if we come to altitude and we're already at a deficit for various reasons, then we're not going to reap the benefits. And I think a lot of athletes don't understand what that looks like. So prior to an athlete coming to altitude, 2 to 4 or even 6 weeks, we'll get blood testing done. And so if we have to have an intervention of nutritional factors, rest and recovery, different type of training, we'll do so before we come so they reap those benefits. And then once they're at altitude, we do blood testing as well. And then we also have a testing called total hemoglobin mass, so that we can do that I'll do at the training center, where we're measuring the hemoglobin, which is a part of the blood that carries all those oxygen molecules, which is part of the iron and things that help to transport oxygen throughout the body, that we can see, is an athlete, are they gaining, are they acclimatizing to altitude, or are they actually not acclimatizing and becoming more fatigued? And then we have to go back, is it the altitude or is it the training prescription, right, with the coach and the intensity, or is it being prescribed correctly and the athlete's not executing it correctly? So then we have to kind of go through those factors as well to figure out, where did we make the mistake? But we've been able to see, with athletes and doing it correctly, up to like a 3 to 4% gain in hemoglobin mass, which is your ability to produce more red blood cells. And if we're doing that, that is helpful. Now, that doesn't translate to a 3 or 4% gain in performance, but it helps your ability to perform and to do more work.
So when you have the athletes that are coming up to the Woodland Park scenario, and to describe that a little bit further, Woodland Park's a town that's higher than Colorado Springs. It's just west of Colorado Springs. It's about 8,500 feet, and that's where the athletes would reside, somewhere around that altitude. And they come down to 6,000 or 6,500 feet in Colorado Springs and actually do their training. You're doing a blood panel on those athletes before they come out to that type of training camp. What are the things specifically that you're looking for in that blood panel to say, okay, you're a good candidate and you're not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple ones are like your red blood cell count and your hematocrit and your hemoglobin. So the really basic blood markers. Then we start looking at the iron levels. So what are their iron levels? What are their ferritin levels, which is the stored iron in your body, which helps to carry those oxygen molecules again throughout the body for ability to do more work and to help produce more red blood cells. So if we have certain athletes and their ferritin values, that stored iron, is below a certain mark, and it's a little bit different for each demographic of athlete, then we say, well, you're actually not coming out to altitude until we can get the number up high enough. Because when you can't do the training that you need to and recover from it effectively at altitude, so it becomes a waste of time. And then, you don't want to lose weeks on training because of just going to where your team is or what you thought was a good idea. But I do agree with you. I mean, I think, similar to what we were talking before the podcast started, is like with all these professional sports, they're going to these isolated environments and they can really focus on their sport and their team. When a lot of athletes go to a quote unquote altitude training camp, it's the same concept. They're either going to a rented house or a hotel, and it's really a period of time that's focused around training and recovery. So we're trying to minimize additional life stresses of, potentially family, friends, your local environment. You're just focusing on training, good nutrition, hydration, and recovery. And I think, when you get all that right, then really good things can happen out of it.
Yeah, but people think because it's called an altitude camp, They're like, oh, I got better at the altitude camp. And then that's how that word spreads, right? Oh, it's the altitude camp. Must be the altitude that made you better. Sometimes it's not always the case. Sometimes it's altitude. But usually, as we know, right, performance and improvement is always multifactorial.
Yeah.
I want to dig a little bit into the blood work that you do in advance of the athletes coming to altitude. You kind of presented this broad array of things that you are looking at, and the listeners are going to want to know like what the answer is. And there are a lot of, and the reason I bring this up is because I did a previous podcast with Shawn Arent, who is a specialist in all these different types of tests. But a lot of athletes will either get blood testing from their primary care physician, or they'll use a third-party vendor like, one of the labs or Inside Tracker or something like that. And inevitably what they get is what their values are in comparison to a reference range and or some sort of stoplight system. Red is bad, yellow is you're okay, and green is good. How does that compare to what you are actually doing as a practitioner and looking at what the athlete is coming to the table in terms of their blood values and saying, okay, you're good to go and you're not?
Yeah. So basically I'll work with our medical team. And if there's a team doctor as well, we'll take a look at it, and even our dietitian. So we're all looking at it for different reasons. The medical is looking at it for overall health. The dietitian is looking at it from a nutritional perspective for supplementation. I'll be looking at it from a performance perspective of, red light, green light, go to altitude or not, or decrease training, or we need to do that. I think what you mentioned earlier is that, yes, an athlete will go, or just a person will go, and you get, here's your range. And that range is just based off the general American population. And it's really broad. Yeah. And two, it's not always for athletes. So what we do with athletes over time is that, yes, you have your recommended range, which is just, the general recommendations, but then we create an athlete specific range, but it's not specific. It's not athlete specific, meaning all track and field 5K runners blood profile should be X. It's actually like athlete A, here's your profile, and here's your highs, here's your lows in that range, and where are you relative to your normal. So as an example, like we have athletes for hemoglobin. When we look at it, they could be on the normal high side of the range of your general range, but that might mean that it's just a normal number for them. So it's not actually high. And then we want to say, okay, well, what do we need to do to, like, where did we go wrong where it's not normal high when we thought it should actually be higher than it is? Is it a hydration thing? Is it, excessive fatigue and not enough recovery, or whatever it might, also other factors it could be?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Lindsay, because one of my pet peeves with a lot of the blood testing companies out there is they are always comparing it to the reference ranges, and they typically don't do as good of a job as I would like them to do comparing it longitudinally with the athlete, which is always what we're doing as a coach. We're looking at, okay, where were you in January? Where were you in April? Where were you in September? Whatever the testing frequency whatever the testing frequency is, and comparing it to that individual athlete. And they could always be green, but if you get one number that's like 40% lower than their previous testing value, but it's still in the reference range, you would look at that and go, no, this is a problem. We got to figure out what's going on here.
Right. Yeah. And I think, the hard thing with that is that, how frequently do you want to get blood tests? So I would say, depending if you're healthy, a healthy check-in in an ideal situation would be like 4 times a year, once a quarter. Now, if you have going to altitude for altitude training camps or doing different things, you're trying to test things, you might get things more frequently. So if we have an athlete that comes in with low iron, we'll put an intervention together and we'll do another retest about 6 weeks after, maybe 4 weeks if we're on a time crunch scale, to see have they responded to that intervention. But at that point, we're also not always doing a complete panel of all the other factors. We're just looking at your typical CBC, your typical blood count, and the iron panel to say, okay, the things that we put in place, is the athlete being compliant, and are we getting the results that we hope to see happen?
100%. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about an altitude camp, right? Athletes go to altitude to train, to get better. And, that works out a lot. But a lot of listeners to this podcast, when they see the title, I haven't made the title up yet. It's going to be something like Heat and Altitude, because those are sexy, title names, and it'll draw more people into it. But it's also your wheelhouse, obviously, because we want to talk about it. A lot of athletes looking at that will put themselves in the scenario of, oh, I'm going to the Leadville Trail 100 and I live in Chicago, or Pikes Peak Marathon is this weekend. This podcast will come out after the Pikes Peak Marathon, but a lot of people from sea level in a normal year will come out to the Pikes Peak Marathon. That'll be their first exposure to altitude, and they will want to know, what do I need to do to get ready for this competition environment that is at high altitude? And now that I'm thinking about it, that's probably one of the top 3 questions that I get asked in any format, whether I do a talk at a running store or whether it's on Instagram or whatever. What do I do? What do I do to get ready for the altitude? And I give my standard stock answer, because I've been asked it so many times. But with all the tools that you have, what would you say to that person who's going to a high altitude environment to compete, and they're coming from a sea level environment where they have to train?
Yeah. Well, I hope our answer is going to be pretty similar.
They will be, trust me.
It goes back to the hydration.
Yeah.
Get as fit as you can before you come out. And you either want to come out as close to your day of competition as possible, or you have to come out like 2 to 3 weeks before to get the acclimatization. And those are the 2 standard things. But, even here in town, I have a handful of running friends that are doing the Pikes Peak Marathon, and they go up to the top of Pikes Peak and they do the 3-2-1 standard workout, where they run 3 miles down, up 3, up, down 2, up 2, down 1, up 1. And they do that quite a bit, and it takes all day to drive up to the top of the mountain, do their workout. And they always say, is that a good one to do? And I said, well, I think it's good to do because it gives you experience of what the trail looks like at the top of the mountain, but it's not necessary from your time management and the fatigue that you get from it. That you don't have to train at 14,000 feet to be able to run at 14,000 feet. Now, if you're living there all the time, yes, that's a different factor. But if most of these races, even an ultra race, you're going up a peak and then you're coming back down. So hopefully your time at the higher extreme altitudes is minimal in the grand scheme of things. And pacing becomes critical to understand your pacing, understand your hydration needs, your nutritional needs at those altitudes. That's really what I think helps when you train at altitude, to understand how you have to actually cut back on your overall, pacing power, your overall output of energy at that high altitude.
This is so boring. It's just get fit.
I know.
We can rename the title to just get fit, to get ready for hot and altitude environments.
I know. I mean, I wish I could say I wish if I wrote a book, I would try to be selling it, but then it'd be like that magic pill of if you take this, it's going to do everything for you. At the end of the day, you have to go back to the foundation of tried and true things of just general physiology. You can't overcome that with any type of magic pill or crazy intervention in a one-off situation.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the 3-2-1 workout. And I think this is worth explaining, because a lot of people are going to be scratching their heads on it. So the Pikes Peak Marathon starts in Manitou Springs, which is 6,700 feet. It goes to the top of Pikes Peak, which is over 14,000 feet, and then goes back down. It's a proper marathon. It was actually the first marathon that had a woman in it, way before the Boston Marathon. Not a lot of people know that. She just came back for what anniversary was it, Lindsay, of her running? I don't know.
I was reading about it on a newsletter somewhere. I can't remember.
It was it was either the 50th or the 60th year that she had done
something.
It. And she got up on the scaffolding. She's, in her late 80s or early 90s now. She got up on the scaffolding that was on the, the start line that's over there in Manitou, just like a pro. I was watching and going, oh my gosh, that's awesome. That is my goal right there.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the Pikes Peak Marathon goes up to the top of Pikes Peak and comes down. And a ridiculously common workout that you will see all of the locals do. And when I moved here and I did the Pikes Peak Marathon for 4 or 5 years in a row or whatever, I vividly remember everybody in town, they would all group up and they would drive to the top of Pikes Peak, because there's a toll road that goes to the top and you can drive your car up there. And they start at the top at 14,000 feet and then go down 3 miles, which just happens to be tree line. There's an aid station there and things like that. And there's a sign, so it becomes a good marker. They'd run down 3 miles and they'd run back to the top. and they'd run down 2 miles and they'd run up to the top, and they run down 1 mile and then run up to the top. So it's called a 3-2-1 workout. And like Lindsay was mentioning, it takes all day because you have to drive to the summit, which is like a 2-hour drive. You have to do the workout, which is really not that long. Like the distance of the workout is not that long, but it takes all day because you're moving so slow and you're above 12,000 feet the entire time. Yeah. It takes all day, and then you have to drive back down. And I remember first thinking about it going, oh, wow, that's a really badass workout. Like you're above 12,000 feet the whole time, and it must be so hard, and you're sucking wind, and it's going to be so good for you. But then I thought about it with my coaching hat. I'm like, that's dumb. Like, that's just a dumb workout.
Yeah. From a physiology perspective, it doesn't make any sense. From an emotional, like I feel prepared,
there you go.
I get it.
There you go.
But to the amount of that local athletes do that workout, I just think it's crazy. Like it's just not a good use of your time from training and recovery. So,
but the practical implications of this is there will be a lot of athletes that are going to a high altitude event and they want to go and do some course recon. And typically what they get drawn to is the higher altitude sections of the course because they feel they need to cover those sections for some reason. Part of that some reason is I'm going to get this physiological adaptation from running or cycling or whatever it is, from running at this high altitude, 12,000 feet. And what we're saying is that's dumb. If you have a reason to run that section just for a psycho-emotional reason or whatever, great, go ahead and do it. But if you think that you're like boosting your red blood cell count or getting a good workout in or whatever, there are probably better ways to skin that cat.
Yeah, for sure. And an example, so a CTS athlete that I still work with, he summited Aconcagua a couple of years ago, and he actually works at the hospital next to the training center. And he's was the oldest guy on his expedition, a 3-week hike up this mountain that goes to 23,000 feet. And so what we did was we'd come into my room in the morning, we'd like have him come in and slowly work on hiking with his pack up to 60 pounds. And we took the room up to about 20,000 feet was the highest that we went just for safety perspective. And I said, we can do this as long as I can poke and prod you. But really the main goal is for you to understand your pacing and what that means at that altitude, just so you have an idea of what your breathing feels like. So you're not going to be too stressed. And we probably did this, once or twice a week for 3 or 4 weeks for a training block. And for that purpose, he said he was the only person on the trip that didn't have any issues. He was the most fit guy there and the oldest guy. But he said a lot of it was just as they got to the higher altitudes, he had a better idea of how to pace himself, right? So it wasn't an altitude acclimatization that we're trying to achieve. It was a educational side of things of when I have this, I have to now be okay with a 20-minute mile walking pace or whatever it might have slowed down to, or running at altitude. You're normally running at an 8-minute pace down here at 7,000 feet, but up there at 14-minute pace, and that's equivalent. And understanding what that caloric expenditure means, and how many more calories you need to be taking in or less calories. I feel like that's where those really training high at an extreme altitude is helpful, but you're not getting as an acclimatization out of it. It's a educational for pacing for your ultimate performance.
So here's the practical piece of that, right? We've already ruled out that the physiology piece of it is kind of null and void. If we've got the scenario of a person from Chicago or Florida or whatever coming out to Leadville, coming out to the Pikes Peak Marathon, and as a coach, you can put your coaching hat on. We want to give them that experience of pacing and nutrition and things like that, of running at 10,000 feet, running at 12,000 feet. Then what do you do?
Yeah, I think you actually just you're never going to be able to exactly mimic it. So, some people say like, oh, you can breathe through a straw and that'll mimic, being at altitude. Well, that's not really what we want to do. I think it's important to, one, try to slow the pace down a little bit. I have a friend who actually lived in Chicago and does the marathon every year. In her first year, she's like, I couldn't believe how hard it was. And I said, well, how much of it were you actually walking at the top rather than running? And she said, a lot of it. And did you ever try hiking, or walking in any of your long runs? And the answer was no. So she wasn't prepared for the biomechanics shift of like hiking in kind of loose, gravelly sand compared to always running. So part of that, you just have to try to find, even if it's not at altitude, just trying to find a hill where you're having to hike up something. So you're mimicking maybe the conditions or the terrain conditions rather than the environmental conditions. And then also being okay and understanding that, yes, I have to slow down by 5% or 6% or 15%, whatever it might be. And then that's actually okay as well.
I've had this experience where I've been, and I don't know if you have as well, watching the Pikes Peak Marathon, is I'll come down from the top to like the 2 mile marker. So that's like 2,500 feet or 12,500 feet or 12,800 feet or something like that. And I'll just watch the athletes go by and, cheer them on. It's a cool spot because, the out and back course, you can see the leaders come back and everybody's, kind of cheering each other on. But I always have this, vivid memory of the people going up will look at their watch and then get this dejected look on their face because they've inevitably looked at their pace and it's like 25-minute miles or something like that, which is kicking ass at that altitude, but not normal in any other circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, I don't know how, that's one where a coach can come into play and help you work through some of those things and be better prepared, and experience is helpful too. But yeah, I mean, that's just a side part of, I think, hopefully if you are not prepared for it and you do it the first time, the second time you better be prepared for it and understand what that is. Right. Yeah. So I can understand the first time being a little bit underprepared and showing up and not, understanding the impacts of altitude. But for, training at altitude, athletes I coach, whether they're a weekend warrior athlete or high level athlete, is like, again, let's get as fit as we can. So when you're at that altitude, your body can handle those conditions even better. So you can make better decisions of saying a 25-minute pace is actually good and I'm not terrible, because it gives you a moment to look around and think, okay, I'm actually keeping in line with everyone else I've been with, or I'm gaining on people at that pace. Yep. And again, I think when you're more fit, you can make better connections in those extreme conditions, whatever they may be.
So Lindsay, you've got all the tools.
Yeah.
And you've got access to even more stuff that is not at the training center. Like you can call the people over at Hypoxico and you can arrange for, this, that, or the other. I think a lot of people want to know, at what point does it make sense to start throwing in some of these other tools that we commonly see for athletes to get prepared for the altitude, like an altitude tent, intermittent hypoxic exposure? Like, at what point do you look at the situation as a coach or as a physiologist working with these types of athletes and say, okay, you need to do something that's outside of the environment that we have at the training center? What does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, listeners won't like my response, to be honest, it's the same thing with some of our elite athletes, that if I think you have 5% more to gain in your day-to-day training, then we don't need to get fancy equipment. So, I have athletes and they want to get into the room and they want to do training. I feel like some of our athletes kind of see that as a rite of passage of like, I'm in this room. I'm an Olympian. I really made it. This is kind of like the icing on the cake. And part of that is saying, like, if you still have 5% more to gain in your career, do we need to go in the room, or do we need to just do our bread and butter, our typical training? So I think, until we get to that point where you think, you're really at the end of your ability to keep gaining fitness, it's not necessary. Now, is it fun to use? For sure. So if you have the ability and you want to use it, I think it's okay to use altitude tents and other devices, but we also want to try them out well in advance to a competition. So if you're getting ready for the Pikes Peak Marathon, as an example, I don't want to use my altitude tent for the first time, 5 or 6 weeks prior to competition. I hope we do 1 or 2 or 3 cycles of using it and understanding how you feel, how that impacts your training, so we actually can do it correctly. So, it's the same thing with biking, and do it too, is that, yeah, I got a new bike and I want it to be the lightest bike as I go up the mountain. Like, I get it. I want the lighter equipment, the newer things. But then you want to make sure that when you have it, you know how to use it properly.
So boring. Just get fit. Don't use all the tools. Well, I always come back to, and I'm going to give proper credit to this since it's your husband. I always come back to a quote that your husband, Dean Golich, I'm going to get him on the podcast too. If we can ever get like his schedule arranged to go and do it, fat chance. But I always remember very early in my coaching career when Dean was beating the crap out of me for something I did wrong, and I mean, what I mean by that is like he was giving me a lecture for something that I had like incorrectly assessed with an athlete.
Yes.
Not physically.
And he's great at that.
He's very good at that. I had Adam Polford on the podcast earlier, and we reminisced about some of the Hunger Games days.
Oh, geez.
Of Dean being the primary instigator of that. But anyway, I remember this. He made a lot of impactful statements and had a big impact on my career. And one of those impactful statements was when we were talking about altitude, and we were going through all of the different scenarios. This is right after the altitude clinic at the training center there several years ago. We were going over all of these different scenarios of when you would use a tent and how you would use it and what the duration is and, blah, 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 blah. I probably spent 2 days talking about this. You probably remember this now that I'm going through the story. And at the end of the whole thing, he looks at everybody, and all of us were other young coaches at the time. And he goes, listen, you guys can talk all of this mumbo jumbo that you want to, but remember, you should win 2 world championships, not just 1, but 2. And then you can think about using an altitude tent for an athlete, because they have so much more to gain just with training and the fundamentals and nutrition and psychology and all of these other things, that if you're talking about your athlete that's coming to the Pikes Peak Marathon, that's going to run a 6-hour Pikes Peak Marathon, which is admirable, and you want to use an altitude for them, look at the lower hanging fruit.
Yep.
So even with the elite athletes, there's normally lower hanging fruit.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, for an altitude perspective in our room, I say no more than I say yes for athletes coming in, for how to incorporate into your training, for that exact reason, is that maybe the timing's not right, or we need to improve in a different area, and that's not how the best use of your time and ability for training and recovery and all the other factors. So,
well, I'm sure in the environment that you have, they want to do anything and everything legally possible to get an edge, because 1% is the difference between, medal and no medal, making the finals, like those little things. And so they're curious, will that actually make a difference? And if it will, they'll take it on. But the fact that you of all people, when that 1% to 2% does make a huge difference, is saying no more than saying yes, I think that says a lot.
Yeah. It's easy to say yes. Really hard to say no and then explain why.
Do you get a lot of pushback and say, no, but I need this? Like, set me up at the tent.
I do. And I think, one, because, the athlete really, again, they don't quite understand. They think they're doing everything they can, right? In reality, if they take a step back, you think, okay, I probably could be doing a little bit better in X, Y, Z. And the other thing, it's this really neat, shiny object that's tangible, like you're walking into a room, rather than just like having to like do one more interval or get another hour of sleep, where you don't see those benefits right away, where you can do the altitude training and you actually do see responses, your return on your investment, I guess, in the training pretty quickly. But the other stuff, it takes time and it takes a lot more energy, in the bigger picture to actually get the reward. So yeah, it's tricky, but it's sport, and I think once you sit down with athletes and coaches and go through it, they totally get it and understand how to use it, and the reason why. And then we plan ahead of, if it doesn't work this cycle, then how are we going to do it next cycle? Which, I think one thing that COVID has been, I think really great for athletes is that it's given us an ability to say, like, put the brakes on. We have a whole year to continue to prepare to be at our best. And without any competitions, which I know for the most of us, it's been challenging because we like going out on our weekend racing. But from an elite perspective, I think it's been really helpful because it's given everybody a time to do a big foundation block of training that they normally never can do because they're chasing points all over the world to qualify for the Olympics. So it's given us the ability to like take a step back and do the hard work and ultimately be better prepared and to use these technologies of altitude and to heat and acclimatization over time and not squeeze them into a 3-month period. But now I have 10 months, 12 months with some athletes of how can we better manage this and get a better return on our training investment that we're putting in. So
it's the way it should be.
Yeah. It's the way it should be, but it's definitely not in the world of, Olympic sport. So,
right. Cause you're always chasing the next thing. I mean, we have this thing in ultramarathon where everybody is just, they're race happy, right? They want to do one race, another race, they'll race 8 or 10 times a year. And there's been a lot of commentary, and I've been part of this commentary that has gone along the lines of, well, since we don't have any races to chase, are all of the races in 2021 or God forbid 2022, whenever they start coming back, are we going to see course records drop, world records drop, and things like that left and right because of this altered landscape of what the training environment has looked like for the last year?
Yeah. And I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, the 5K world record was just broken.
Smashed.
Just a few days ago. And, when you go through their preparation, that was one of the things that he said. He said, I actually had time to focus on training. I wasn't having to go to these track meets to make money and to qualify, my spot as an athlete or my team as a country. I could just focus on my training, and all of a sudden a world record is broken, I think, and it had stood for 16 years in the 5K. And so it's possible that in 2021, we're going to see world records for a lot of timed events drop, for certain courses. So.
Have you seen, we were planning on talking about this because this is going to be like heat and altitude, but I do want to get into part of how COVID is impacting the Olympics from your perspective. Have you, relating to that theme, have you seen a lot of athletes like overarching training architecture change once they knew that, okay, it's 2021, here are the dates, we're not going to be doing much for 2020. Did you see a market change in that?
With my sports, not necessarily. I mean, I think one of the big things is that rather than, trying to push through the spring when everything started to get canceled, we just told everyone, said, hey, let's stop. Let's take a season break right now. Anywhere from like 1 week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks for some athletes, something that, that's a long break for a lot of athletes, 3 weeks that they haven't taken for many years. And then it allowed us to say, okay, when they came back, we know we have 13 months of training, and we just looked at the calendar and then just basically said, we're going to only focus on the Olympics. And if there's any events along the way, we'll come back and fill those in and, reconfigure our planning. But ultimately I feel like it's been positive for the programs that I work with. One, cycling athletes could still go out and ride their bikes every day. They weren't stuck inside.
Yeah.
Sports like boxing and wrestling and swimming, they were really impacted initially from COVID. And I think that was a bigger challenge for those groups. But cycling, triathlon, running, they could still do all their training. So I feel like it's mentally, it's negative, but from a physiological perspective, it's pretty ideal in the timeline that they have to now regroup, recover, and rebuild for the next 10 months getting ready for the games.
Yeah, because when they announced the Olympics, it was like in May or June. Is that right?
Yeah, I can't remember, something around then. Yeah.
So the picture that you're kind of painting is almost like a post World Championships type of setup where they take a pretty hard break, and then they've got, in the Olympics case, this is 13 months, but in a World Championship case, it's usually like 3, 4, 6, 8 months to where they have their next kind of like big competition.
Yeah.
Wow. But then I think the fact that it's highly unlikely that there will be a lot of events until then, that's the thing that's really different.
Yeah, it is tricky. And, I think everybody's trying to figure out what that means. And again, for some, it's not an issue. I feel like with our elite level athletes, that they're very internally motivated. So they don't necessarily have to have a competition throughout the buildup to think like, I need to have 2 or 3 peaks leading into the Olympics. Like everyone is okay with like, I'm good peaking for my competition on August 3rd or whatever date it might be. And I think that's the a little bit of a different mentality than someone like myself, where I'm like, I kind of need a carrot to keep myself going and motivated day in and day out. That timeline, 10 months, 12 months from now, that's enough motivation no matter what, to get up every day and to do what they need to get done.
Have you guys been able to test just as frequently there? Or was it like shut down for certain period of time?
We've been shut down. So still right now, we're not doing any physical testing. So I can do testing like not in our labs, our performance lab. So no testing like VO2 max testing, lactate testing or blood testing. We're not doing anything in that close proximity at this point. I'm sure we'll get back to that here pretty soon. But really, we can do any testing that I can keep an appropriate and safe distance from an athlete. And that's anywhere between 6 to 12 feet, depending on the intensity and how many people are in a room. So the good thing with our sports is that there's so much wearable technology, is that we can still do a lot of training and a lot of testing, minus taking blood lactates or, other type of blood values. Or typical like a VO2 value, but I could get a machine set up and have an athlete run and kind of then step back 6 to 12 feet, and monitor the cart and different things while they're doing it. So we haven't done that, but we have all the equipment and set up to do so when the time comes. But we're getting there. I would say, like I mentioned earlier, that Road World Championships are still happening. We have a few athletes. There are quite a few athletes here in town right now. So the velodrome in town is back up. I've been going in a couple times a week there, being there with the athletes and the coaches and getting back into training. But we all have our masks on. We're all keeping our distance. Our training times are longer because we can only have so many athletes at the velodrome at one time. So what might normally have been a 2 or 3 hour training session or day turns into a 6-hour day because we have to have multiple groups. But the athletes can still get in their training. They're still getting the coaching feedback and the data that they need to keep moving forward.
Yeah, it's weird, man. It's really weird.
Yeah, it is crazy.
But I mean, athletes will figure it out, right? I mean, if we've learned anything with working with a lot of high level athletes, is they always find a way. They always figure it out.
Yeah. Yes.
All right, Lindsay.
Cool.
We're going to let you go.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to listening to the podcast and all future podcasts that you have. But let me know if you have any questions or anything else along the way. On altitude or heat, I'm here.
I appreciate your time, Lindsay, but more importantly, I've always appreciated your counsel and like being a colleague of yours over the years. You're smart as a whip. You, as the listeners now know, you're very pragmatic in the advice that you give everybody, from the elite athletes to myself to, everyday athletes that we work with. And I've always thought that the practitioners that work in the sports science field that can be that translational physiologist, is that the term that you use?
Yeah,
I'm going to totally steal that from you now.
I stole it from someone. I can't remember. I heard it on a podcast and I was like,
I'm using
that.
Makes sense. Okay. Well, we tend to recycle and borrow things from everybody anyway, so I don't think anybody's going to get offended. But the practitioners that are in the sports science field that can take the information that we can derive from laboratory settings and bring them into a real world application, those are few and far between, because all too often we want to use all the tools that we have available. We want to use all the technology. We want to use all of the data, even to the detriment of the end user, which are the athletes. And you do not do that. You take what you need and you leave aside what you don't. And the manifestation of that is just get fit. Great.
Yeah. It's simple.
All right. I love it. We're going to let you go, Lindsay. I hope to see you down the line. We'll have our masks on and everything, but good luck to the athletes, and good luck to you and your group in Tokyo.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
And there you have it. There you go. Appreciate the heck out of Lindsay, as I mentioned on the podcast, over the course of however many years I've known her, for her counsel, and appreciate her time that she spent with us on the podcast today. Hope everybody found that enlightening. If you do get the chance, and after the COVID-19 pandemic starts to wind down, do yourself a favor, go to the Olympic Training Center and take one of their tours. It is absolutely fascinating. They go by a lot of these different areas of the training center that Lindsay mentioned that the athletes have access to, but they open it up to the public, and they do it in a really insightful way where sometimes the staff of the training center will take you around, and many times the athletes themselves will actually take you around. And I'm not a big person for a lot of the tourist things that you can do in normal tourist towns, but this is one that I think is definitely worth it. So if you're ever in town, do yourself a favor, go to the training center and take that tour. Appreciate to all of the listeners out there. If you've not had the chance, skip on over to Apple Podcasts and give this podcast a rating or a review. It means the world to me when I see those 5-star ratings come across the wire. Appreciate everybody listening today. We will see you out on the trails.